So, a lot of people have been asking me to rank my favourite James Bond movies, and the problem is there are so many people who've done so many great videos ranking James Bond movies. What can I add to the equation? Well, you know what? I'm a writer, so maybe we could talk about James Bond movies in terms of their writing. Which are the 5 best written James Bond movies? Stay tuned. Hi guys, it's me. I'm making a quick video because I wanted to. Because I haven't made videos in a while, and I wanted to make a video about James Bond movies, ranking James Bond movies. And there are so many brilliant content creators who've made so many brilliant videos ranking James Bond movies that it was difficult to figure out something that I could do to bring something new to that. But I think I'm onto something, because I'm a writer, and I love storytelling, and I love stories, and I love the way stories are constructed. And I thought, maybe I could rank the James Bond movies on the best written James Bond movies. And I don't think anyone's ever done that before. Because let's be honest, when you think of James Bond movies, you don't necessarily think of the writing. I mean, when you think of Ian Fleming, you think of writing. But when you think of the Bond movies themselves, writing generally isn't something that you immediately think about. It's like James Bond movies aren't renowned the world over for how well written they are, even though some of them are very well written. But writing is a very intrinsic part to what makes Ian Fleming's James Bond such an iconic figure and resonates so deeply with so many of us. And there are some really, really great written movies in the James Bond canon. I don't think writing has ever been like the focus of the James Bond franchise. I think there are some great movies that aren't necessarily that well written. They're just so iconic and have just such amazing set pieces and acting and scenes and things. But generally, I would say the best written James Bond movies are also the James Bond movies that tend to rank highest in people's personal rankings. So there's definitely a correlation there. And writing in general is like a very, very important part for the success of anything. And what is it about writing that makes a good movie? What is it about writing that makes a good James Bond movie? And I was thinking that, I was really pondering it. Because James Bond movies, they have a kind of formula. And, you know, check boxes you have to tick, you know. You have the cold open, and then you have the briefing scene, and the gadget scene, and meeting the bad guy, you know, in a formal setting, and then finding out the bad guy's the bad guy, and the Bond girl, and all these different elements. It's almost like a jigsaw puzzle. But the best written James Bond movies manage to accomplish 2 things. And the first is coherence. So when you have a James Bond movie, generally you get James Bond on this mission, and he has to follow this path towards the eventual conclusion of the movie, which is normally some big fight in the bad guy's lair. And good James Bond movies make that journey coherent, as in it makes sense. The villain's evil scheme makes sense. Why James Bond goes here, why James Bond goes there, why James Bond goes here, they all make sense. And that's something that is not necessarily common within the Bond canon. In recent years, the worst offender for that has to be Spectre. It's like Spectre is a spectacular film, and there are some beautiful set pieces and things like that. But when we come down to it, my biggest complaint with Spectre is it's just dumb. It doesn't really make sense. The plot doesn't really make sense. You don't understand why James Bond's doing this. Why is James Bond at this, killing this guy? Why is it this funeral? Why is he driving his car off a boat? What is Blofeld doing there? Oh my God, Blofeld's his brother. I mean, it is just a mess. It's a badly written movie, and that's one of the things that torpedoed it. Whereas there are other movies that have very good, very coherent writing. One movie I will mention that is not on my list of the top 5 best written James Bond movies is License to Kill. License to Kill is like a real journey outside of what we're familiar with in James Bond. But as a story, it's a really coherent story. You've got a really powerful plot device, and that James Bond wants revenge against the people who maimed his best friend. And the journey he goes on from point to get to the conclusion is a very well-written, coherent story. It makes sense. You're not left scratching your head going like, what the hell is James Bond doing here? Which in a movie like Quantum of Solace, another one, I love the action sequences, the chase scenes. It's all very frenetic and stuff. But I have to admit, I was sitting there being like, wait, why is he here now? Why is he chasing that guy? What's he doing now? He just killed him. Shouldn't he get the clues? Yeah, it didn't make sense. Whereas something like License to Kill made sense. So coherency is a very, very, very important part of making a successful James Bond film. The other thing, the more important thing, is emotional resonance. You've got to feel an emotion. I mean, we talk about storytelling, and storytelling on a big scale, on a macro scale, is like this circle for your lead character to go on a journey and you know, come back to where he started again as a different person. But in the small term, you can tell stories in a tweet, or in a 2-minute video on Twitter, or a short video on Instagram, because a story consists of making the viewer feel an emotion, and then at the end of this, you make them feel a different emotion. That's the journey, and that's why you can make television commercials that, like Budweiser makes commercials for the Super Bowl every year, and some of them make me cry because they're beautiful, and they make, you know, you've got one emotion and then you've got another emotion. That's what a story is. So a James Bond film that actually reaches in and makes you feel something, that's really, really powerful. And a good example of that, again, which is definitely not going to be on my list of the top 5 best written James Bond movies, but for me, No Time to Die was quite effective in terms of the emotional resonance it had. It had some elements that really resonated with me, and I have to admit, I had water coming out of my eyes a couple of times in that movie. And, you know, maybe it's just because I'm in my 40s and it just really hit a couple of beats that are specific to me. But either way, that movie was quite successful in having that emotional resonance there. Wasn't so successful in keeping James Bond alive at the end. Wasn't so successful maybe in the coherence thing. But yeah, emotionally, it worked. So for me, when I was judging all the James Bond movies and trying to come up with the 5 best written James Bond movies, the 2 things I was looking for was plot coherence and then some kind of emotional resonance. So let's jump into it, shall we? Let's talk about the movies that succeed there. So there are 5 James Bond movies that I picked as the 5 best written, but we're going to start off with some honourable mentions. So for me, one movie that I really, really was keen on having on the list, but I picked another one instead, and I'll explain why, was The World Is Not Enough. I thought The World Was Not Enough is a great movie. It's got a plot that really makes sense all the way through it. You understand what is going on. It's got a twist in the end that's coherent. I really like that. And it's got the emotional resonance, because James Bond's relationship with Elektra is fantastic in that movie. You can see he really feels for her. And then her story, being kidnapped and having part of her ear cut off, and what she's doing and what's driving her reasoning. You really sympathise with her until the climax of the movie, and then you realise she's the bad guy. But to a certain extent, you still sympathise with her, and you've got that moment where James Bond has to shoot her, where you're like, that does hit you. You actually feel like that James Bond is having some emotional conflict. And I think the Daniel Craig movies always tried to make everything super, super personal. The good thing about the Pierce Brosnan movies is they didn't, but they still made it realistic. He still could have an emotional reaction to things. I nearly added The World Is Not Enough to my top 5 just because of Bond's relationship with Elektra. I just thought that was great. Didn't quite make it because the whole Christmas Jones thing. As much as I love Denise Richards. Denise Richards is wonderful, but you could have lifted Christmas Jones out of that entire movie with no issue whatsoever and focused on Elektra. So I would have done that. So it's not one of my top 5 best written, but I will definitely give kudos to The World Is Not Enough. Great, great movie. Good, strong writing there. The next movie that I think is really good in terms of the writing is From Russia with Love. I really enjoyed that. As a Cold War thriller, that was really, really enjoyable. You didn't quite have the emotional resonance of the movie, of what you wanted. I mean, you know, James Bond was basically just playing Titania to get this machine from her, and she was playing him because of her orders from Rosa Klebb. And so you didn't have the emotional resonance with that, but in terms of like a coherent spy movie, it was excellent. It also loses points to me to a bit because they hadn't established the James Bond formula at that point. But I think it's kind of like a Cold War Hitchcock-esque spy thriller. It works brilliantly. And I also like the way they took what Ian Fleming had given them and kind of improved it in a few points. This is going to be important later. Like the Spectre machine, obviously Ian Fleming invented Spectre, the criminal organisation, and then he had this machine called the Spectre, so they very cleverly called it the Lecter in the James Bond movie. There was little twists and little elements that I thought made it a very, very strong adaptation of Ian Fleming's original story. So that's an honourable mention as well. And the third honourable mention is, and this nearly made it to my list, The Living Daylights. I really like The Living Daylights. I think it is a great movie. I think it's a really well-written movie. The movie works because you have these villains, and you think they're working for the Soviets, but actually one of them is a turncoat. So it's going through this 80s thing as a kind of hangover from the Roger Moore days, where you weren't making the Russians the explicit bad guys. You were making elements within Russia the bad guys. So I thought that worked. It took some direct things like that brilliant sniper scene in the beginning directly from Ian Fleming's books. I thought that was fantastic. And then as the plot wound out, it made a lot of sense. It was coherent. It worked. I thought what worked really well was James Bond's relationship with Cara. It actually seemed kind of romantic, and I believed in them as a couple. I think James Bond was just like playing her. This is clearly not one of the loves of his life, but it was a very believable romance between the two. So that was a very, very strong entry, I thought. But it didn't quite make it because there can only be 5 winners in my 5 best written James Bond movies. And so let's move on to those, shall we? So coming in at number 5, this might actually come as a surprise to some people, but I nominate The Spy Who Loved Me. I think The Spy Who Loved Me is a brilliantly written James Bond movie for exactly the 2 reasons I mentioned earlier. First, the plot. The plot is really simple and coherent. In fact, this is the template for a James Bond movie. There is an evil villain. He's trying to do something to jeopardize the entire world, and James Bond has to follow a trail of clues, and it literally is like a trail of clues. He goes and meets his old school chum in the Saudi Arabian desert, who's like, you will eventually meet with a man called Fakesh, but first of all, you must meet with this person. So it's like, you will eventually arrive at this location, the pyramids, but first you must go to this location, the club. So it is kind of like a paint by numbers, but it walks you through a very coherent plot that makes sense and wraps up satisfyingly at the end. What it also does really, really well is has that relationship between James Bond and Anya. Because when you look at it, the concept of a British secret agent and a Soviet secret agent that are thrust together, she has a reason to really hate him, to want to kill him, but over the course of the story and the adventure, she overcomes that and falls in love with him. It's a love story. It's a romance story. I mean, that is enemies to lover romance. There are books like that by the bucketful on Amazon in the romance section. That really worked. That was just a really cool idea. I liked it. That's something that Ian Fleming probably would have wished that he came up with, this whole idea of an enemy spy falling for James Bond. Love it. And it was, to me, the template for the perfect James Bond movie. I mean, it is. This is where everything fits together, and it fits together. There's no movie in which it fits together quite as well as The Spy Who Loved Me, with perhaps one exception. So I think that deserves, very richly deserves, a 5th place on my spot. Be interested to see if you disagree. But let's move on to number 4. Number 4, I nearly ranked higher. I nearly ranked highest, actually. It is my personal favourite James Bond movie, and that is On Her Majesty's Secret Service. And On Her Majesty's Secret Service is brilliantly written because it is almost 100% lifted from the Ian Fleming novel. All of the elements are translated very, very, very coherently to the screen. The plot makes a lot of sense. There are some weird things that don't quite make sense, like how come James Bond, who met Blofeld in the previous movie, now isn't recognised by Blofeld? Well, that's obviously because they've got different actors. They've got George Lazenby as a new actor and Terry Savalas as a new actor. So within the conceit of the movie, that actually works as far as I'm concerned. And it is ultimately a really coherent story. Blofeld has a really coherent, plot that he's coming up with. There's a really satisfying denouement to that. And then you've got the emotional love story between them. And it's an iconic love story between Bond and Tracy. Diana Rigg is amazing. And the way she's written as a heroine, there's just something vividly authentic about it. And also she's amazing because she is the foil intellectually to Blofeld. She's physically able to look after herself. She's brave, she's fearless, she's vulnerable, she's got a heart. It's a beautifully written character and it works. And I know it's not everybody's favourite James Bond film because George Lazenby plays a very different James Bond to Sean Connery. I know it's not everybody's favourite James Bond movie because it is quite grounded and takes a lot directly from the book. It doesn't have all this reliance on the gadgets and things like that. But in terms of a well-written, coherent, emotionally resonant story, it is great. And I love that. And I think that absolutely deserves 4th place. If there weren't other movies, it would rank higher than that. And it's my personal favourite James Bond movie. So number 3, though, let's move on to what might be a surprising entry to people. And that is Tomorrow Never Dies. A lot of people are like, what? What? I'll tell you what Tomorrow Never Dies is. Tomorrow Never Dies is The Spy Who Loved Me done better. Because it is. Tomorrow Never Dies is like a James Bond paint-by-numbers exercise. You've got the evil megalomaniacal villain. You've got the villain's lair at the end. You've got him jet-setting to all these other places. You've got the car with the gadgets, the briefing scene with Q, great scene with M, a fantastic cold open. It's like the perfect James Bond movie. And I think the reason people don't love it as much as it deserves to be loved is because it is kind of, it's like when you read Shakespeare now, it seems kind of hackneyed because so much of popular culture has taken everything from Shakespeare. And when you did it the first time, it sounds great. When you've seen it redone a million times and you go back to the original article, you're like, what? But with Tomorrow Never Dies, it is the paint-by-numbers James Bond movie. I think people don't necessarily always like it because it's the paint-by-numbers James Bond movie, but it works. And I think it works better than The World Is Not Enough. If you're like not having Christmas Jones in that, just having a much more coherent and tighter plot. Michelle Yeoh as the Bond girl, she really works because they have a relationship and she doesn't seem to just be like inserted in that. So coherently, brilliant movie. Like a very simple plot and a very simple desire by the bad guy, but it works. And then it has emotional resonance. I think that when Tomorrow Never Dies was written, let's see, who wrote Tomorrow Never Dies? It was, I'm just trying to see who actually wrote it in my little list here. Written by Bruce Fernstein there. I really liked the way they handled Paris Carver in that movie. Because the problem is with James Bond, if you want to get some emotion out of him, because you want the film to be emotionally resonant. It's difficult though, and I think you can over-egg the cake and go down some rabbit holes you don't want to. Like with Spectre, the whole idea of making Blofeld his pseudo-brother was just, oh my god, what were they thinking? Whereas in Tomorrow Never Dies, you've got this very simple thing. Paris Carver had a previous relationship with Bond. He's got that emotional attachment to her, and when she dies, he feels bad about it. Boom. That's excellent. You make James Bond feel an emotion. You can feel it, you can understand it on screen, and then there's a coherent story wrapped around it. I think it is, as much as you can get, the perfect James Bond movie. You open up a chest, you pull out the James Bond movie, blow the dust off it. This is it. This is James Bond in a nutshell. Tomorrow Never Dies. Take it. Go on. There we go. That's yours. So that's why it comes in at number 3 on my list. And as much as you might disagree with that, if you want to explain why you disagree, leave me a comment down below. Because I think when you think about it, yeah, it's a really fair entry onto that list. Okay, number 2 on my list for best written James Bond movie is Casino Royale. And obviously we're not talking about the 1967 one there. No. Casino Royale, let's see, it was screenplay by Neil Purvis, Robert Wade, Paul Haggis. You're wondering why I'm going like that. It's because my screen's right there. Yeah, I loved Casino Royale. I thought it was a brilliantly written movie. It was so tough to take that one book that had never been adapted before and adapt it to the screen in a way that made sense to modern audiences who had watched 20 James Bond movies beforehand. Like, you had to have all the James Bond beats in it, but at the same time you wanted to be loyal to the book, and that's exactly what they did with the screenplay. The first half of it was this amazing action-adventure film that lives up to Jason Bourne and whatever was going on at the time. It was oh, someone's got a big car outside. Anyway, the first half of Casino Royale is just a nail-biting, thrill-a-second adventure. Loved it. Really, really got into that. And then they changed gears completely. And the rest of it is pretty much Casino Royale out of the book. Except it's in Montenegro or the north of France. But the rest of it, it's so well adapted to our 21st century sensibilities, yet remaining true to the book. I think the way they wrote Mads Mikkelsen as Le Chiffre was brilliant. The way, you know, he was not the bad guy sitting there eating shrimp like Stromberg or whatever. He was actually a guy who had his own vulnerabilities, and he was doing things because he was out of options, and he was a dangerous, evil man, but at the same time, he was terrified of the people coming after him. So I think it worked really well in terms of that. The brutality of that torture scene, which was straight out of the book, worked so well. And then there were the little dry things where James Bond's like, oh, you died scratching my balls. That shows off the character of James Bond. I mean, it is pretty much a flawless adaptation of the book. If you wanted to make an adaptation of Casino Royale for a 21st century audience, you could not do any better than they did. But of course, they did do better than they did because they had the love story with Vesper, which is iconic. And to me, the Vesper love story is probably the love story of the James Bond franchise. As much as I love Tracy, I love Diana Rigg. Like, Vesper is where it's at. Casino Royale is where it's at. Their love story was so believable and so touching, and the chemistry between Daniel Craig and Eva Green was amazing. The tragedy at the end really did reach into you. There are few James Bond movies, I think, that have that same emotional resonance, and it wasn't done cheaply. Like, you could argue in No Time to Die, yeah, they kind of pulled a few cheap shots to get to tug on those heartstrings, whereas in Casino Royale, it was just authentic. It was done beautifully. And those two elements together, I just think make it a really, 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 really well-written James Bond film. Arguably the best. I think you could make that argument, but I got one more, number one on my list. My number one for the best written James Bond movie, and based off everything I've said, you might be surprised by this, is Goldfinger. Goldfinger. Goldfinger, that's the James Bond movie. That's the James Bond movie. And part of it is because the writing of Goldfinger was brilliant. Now, let me go to the Goldfinger. Let's see. It was screenplayed by Richard Maybaum and Paul Dehn. Goldfinger did something amazing in that it took the original novel by Ian Fleming and it made it better. It made it considerably better. Now, I love Goldfinger as a novel. It's one of my favourite novels. It is a badly written book. The plot is practically incoherent. Goldfinger finds this guy trying to kill him and then, of course, adopts him as his secretary. Goldfinger trying to go with the Russians to raid Fort Knox and disappear off with the gold. I mean, it's bonkers. You read it and you can tell that Ian Fleming was like, well, I've come this far with this story. With his huge cigarette lighter. Lunch is in half an hour. I guess I'll just go with it. And he like forces out this plot that just doesn't make sense. And the book is so charming in so many other ways. That's why I love it. But when Eon got hold of the rights to Goldfinger, they must have looked at him and be like, what are we going to do with this? And their whole idea of switching the bank raid smash and grab, lifting off all of this gold in trains and switching it for blowing up a dirty bomb inside Fort Knox and irradiating the gold, that's genius. That's so clever. And it makes all of the plot come together and makes so much more sense. And the way they scrapped that whole thing of James Bond becoming his secretary, and it's like he captures James Bond and he has to be civil with him to parade him in front of the FBI so they know they haven't killed him. That, again, it just works really well. And it explains why you can have all these delicious scenes where James Bond is face-to-face having these civilized conversations with Goldfinger, but at the same time not being conceited like their relationship in the book was. I think that works really, really well. So in terms of coherence, this is the movie where they like snapped the whip and made James Bond coherent. And I think it's, in terms of the miracle they wrought with the writing, I think Goldfinger is the strongest example. In terms of emotional resonance, I don't think it has the same emotional resonance as other movies that I've mentioned. But James Bond feels things, and you feel things for James Bond. You watch that scene where, you know, where Gilly is dead and covered in gold paint, and you can see he feels bad about it. He is emotionally upset about it. And that kind of comes across in the briefing when he has with M. It's like, you weren't meant to steal her girlfriend, but you can see he feels bad about the fact she died. And then when Tilly dies as well, you can feel, he feels bad about it. There's also the scene where he's on the table with the laser beam coming between his legs. Sean Connery looks genuinely scared. Like, for the only, perhaps the only time in his entire run as James Bond, it's like, oh shit, how am I going to get out of this? And you actually believe that. So it might not have like the same gut punch as Vesper dying or Tracy dying or something like that, but it does work on an emotional level. You can actually believe that James Bond has emotions, which, you know, that's not something that is always there in the movies. Thunderball, for example, would have been up here higher because it's got quite a coherent plot, but it just has nothing in terms of like the emotion. Goldfinger has just enough where I think it deserves to be placed at the number one spot, because in many ways it is, to my estimation, the best written James Bond movie. Not necessarily my favourite, not necessarily the best, although arguably the best. But in terms of the writing, I think it is the best written James Bond movie, because it has the coherence and it does pull you in emotionally. And those are the two things that really, really count. So, that's me. I'm done pontificating. Let me know if you agree or disagree. What are your most emotional James Bond movies or best written James Bond movies? Let me know in the comments down below. And if you like this video, give me a thumbs up. If you haven't already, make sure you hit that subscribe button. And yeah, and as long as you keep watching, I'll keep making them. Ciao. I'm Roland Hume. I've sold 67,000 copies of my books. If you want to find out how I did it, I've got the link right here you can click. And otherwise, don't forget to subscribe. I've got more videos coming soon. Thank you.